Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Katerji Show with me, your host, Katerji. And now we have, a really wild scenario unfolded this week watching Ahmed Al-Sharaa, the now president of Syria, but also famously a former commander in Al-Qaeda, being interviewed by the man who led the Iraqi surge, David Patraeus, in New York. So it was for anyone who's followed US foreign policy over the past few decades, this would have been a rather unexpected event to see in your lifetime. But it is something that we have seen. We've covered Syria quite a lot over the course of this show, doing little bits and bobs, trying to get up to speed with what's happening in Syria. Today we're going to focus more on the diplomatic aspect and, what the new authorities in Syria are doing to try and reach out to the international community. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Aaron Zelin. Aaron, you wrote a book on Ahmed Al-Sharaa and HTS. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll dive into what we've seen happen over the past 24 hours, 48 hours, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. The book came out in May 2022, so it's already almost 3.5 years ago now. So obviously before the fall of the regime, and a few things changed between then and now, of course. But
just
essentially
a little
at the
bit,
time,
just a little bit of change.
Yeah. I mean, I even met the guy in person now just last week, which I never thought would ever happen. But yeah, I mean, it was essentially trying to look at sort of the transformation we were beginning to see of Shara at the time. Of course, Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, his kunya, as well as his group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which originally had been first part of the Islamic State, then broke from them in 2013. Then Al-Qaeda broke from them in 2016, and then became sort of this independent organization focused locally on just the fight against Assad, as well as developing sort of a local governance apparatus. And so a lot of what the book was looking at is sort of this transformation from going essentially from global jihad to this local administration. Of course, they're still, conservative, Islamist in many ways. But sort of the transformation that we saw since, the offensive in late November last year to December 8th with the fall of the regime, up into everything that's happened since, the transformation's gone into hyperdrive in many regards also. And so you saw sort of this transformation essentially from 2016 until the book came out. But in the last, 9-10 months or so, it's been even more than anybody could have even imagined that had focused on it closely. But I think for most Syrians, they're obviously, happy that it's in this direction, because it's one thing to sort of rule northwest Syria, which in Idlib province in particular, primarily 98% Sunni Muslim, pretty conservative area, versus once you start getting out into the rest of the country, more cosmopolitan cities in Aleppo and Damascus. Obviously, there's far more minority groups in many different spaces. And so, of course, there's secular Muslims too. And so, they can't just completely follow the Idlib model. And at least so far, overall, they've been doing a relatively good job. Of course, there have been things that have occurred that are not good either, such as the massacre that happened against Alawites in March on the coast. And then more recently, now 2 months ago, the massacre that happened against the Druze in Sweda. But thankfully, we haven't seen anything outside of that.
So yeah, we have covered both of those issues on this show. So I do advise you go back into our YouTube archive and check out those episodes in particular. But this is still a new chapter for Syria. This is having a Syrian president participating in the UN General Assembly is something that many Syrians didn't think they'd see in their lifetime, for better or for worse, or for whatever reason. It is still a rather remarkable event. Can you talk us through what's happened over the last few days, how that all came to pass? Because it wouldn't have been easy to get him to New York. There obviously had to be hurdles passed with the US to make that happen, and also your meeting with him. And I think we can talk more about the transformation and the ideology. But why don't we just go through the events of the last few weeks as they happened, and then we'll discuss it from there.
Sure. I mean, it's important context to note that this is now the first time that a Syrian president has actually spoken in front of the United Nations General Assembly since 1967. And so it's very historical in many ways. It never happened under Hafiz or Bashar al-Assad. And so I think for this new government, as well as for many Syrians, they see this as a return to the world stage and moving forward and turning the page on what happened during the 13-14 year civil war in many ways, let alone the 54 years of the Assad regime totalitarian rule. As a consequence of course, the history of Shara and his prior group, at least at the UN, they continue to be designated as terrorists. We know that in the US, they removed that designation a few months ago now, but because the designation system has to be unanimous between the Security Council members, the US has pushed for them to be removed there as well. But of course, there's pushback by Russia a little bit, but mainly a lot of it's related to China because there continues to be Uyghur foreign fighters that are a part of the Syrian military now and security for Shara in particular. Of course, these are the groups of people that are originally from Xinjiang. And as we know, the Chinese have committed a genocide against the Uyghurs over the last 15 or 20 years, where at least 1 million have been killed. And so for the Chinese, this is an issue. So until that changes, they will continue to be designated. But as a consequence, there has to be this whole bureaucratic process that provides special permissions and visas for somebody like Shara to not only travel to the US, but also to do something at the UN as well. And so that was essentially something that needed to be dealt with. And of course, it was, since he did speak earlier today at the General Assembly now, maybe an hour or two ago. And then, as part of sort of him coming to the US and the UN, alongside a broader delegation that included the foreign minister, the minister of information, the minister of social affairs, I think the minister of economy and finance might be here as well. But they've set up a series of meetings, both private and public, with different institutions and individuals. One of the larger ones that you referenced was this Concordia Forum, where David Patraeus was essentially interviewing him in an exchange. We also saw that Charles Lister last night, in more of a private event from the Middle East Institute, also had an exchange with an audience, but it was sort of not necessarily off the record, but it wasn't publicized with a video like the Concordia one. And then there's a bunch of bilateral and multilateral meetings that the Syrian delegation has been doing with other countries as well. Of course, a lot of them are with some of their key allies, including now the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, things like that. We also, at least know that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce had a special private meeting with Shara and Shebani. Part of this is to introduce American companies to Syria because, of course, one of the key things that the country is attempting to accomplish now after the fall of the regime is to try and revitalize the economy, rebuild the country, bring it back from sort of all of the destruction wrought by the Assad regime during the civil war. And so connecting them with key American businesses now that sanctions have been taken off or eased, depending on which ones we're talking about, it's definitely a huge step forward.
Can you tell us about the speech then? Obviously, it has only happened, within the last hour or so. Could you tell us some of the key points, the key takeaways that you personally took away from that speech? What you think he's trying to say in his first address to the United Nations as the head of state of Syria?
I think in many ways he's trying to introduce sort of the new Syrian narrative about where the country is today and explaining, who he is and who is behind him. A lot of it is context on the war itself and what happened in terms of, the number of people killed, number of displaced and refugees, the destruction that was wrought, the chemical weapons, the barrel bombs, as well as the perseverance of the Syrian people in many respects, and then sort of juxtaposing that with what they're attempting to accomplish now in the aftermath of the fall of the regime in terms of you know uh, developing all these relationships with a variety of countries, in particular Turkey, a number of Gulf states, of course the U.S., Europe, as well as some other countries too. But those have been some of the key ones, of course. Um, and then potential investment opportunities in different memorandum of understanding and deals that they've been signing in recent months in particular. Of course, some of these they won't necessarily have the effect right away and they're more longer term projects, but it's showing the initiative that they're having. But also trying to highlight that they're interested in transitional justice too, and bringing the former regime to account, and making sure it's done within the context of the rule of law. Obviously, some within the country are not necessarily happy with how slow they perceive that process or the lack of transparency of that process. Um, but part of it is, at least from their perspective, based off of conversations I've had, is that they worry if they update it too much, it could undermine the investigations. Whatever one thinks of that, I've heard that it's happening. It's just more behind the scenes at this point. And then I think they're thinking the countries that have helped them in starting to rebuild itself, in terms of its reputation on an international stage, but also in terms of now assisting with humanitarian aid, as well as bringing in energy and hopefully helping rebuild the country too. And then I'd say that there's one final thing that was interesting, just because it's been of course, contentious issue since the fall of the regime, is related to the conduct of Israel. He didn't really specifically talk about it in the context of Israel's airstrikes or their incursions that have happened in Syria, but essentially saying, more vis-a-vis Gaza in particular, that we Syrians, we went through this terrible and horrific experience, so we understand the plight of what's going on in Gaza, and we don't wish it upon anybody else. So, in a sense, an indirect message to Israel as well, even if it wasn't specific to some of the negotiations that many people have been talking about, related to whether there's going to be some new, border arrangement related to, everything that's happened since the fall of the regime.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, we can dive into that, because I think that's a fascinating topic. But it must be said, the Lebanese president as well issued similar condemnation of Israel's conduct in Gaza, and with the president of Lebanon and the new president of Syria, these are kind of states that these current administrations are not as hostile to Israel as other administrations over time have been. So for them, in the disadvantageous position they are both in with regards to the recent conflict with Israel, to be saying this at the UN General Assembly does speak to I don't think they'd be saying this if they didn't think it was important enough to make the point, basically. So I do think it's interesting talking about how this relationship with Israel is going to develop over time. But before we do that, I do want to focus quite a lot on that. Before we do that, I wanted to ask you about meeting Al-Sharaa. We've had Charles Lister on before, and he told us about, but this was before he met with him, obviously. He told us about this transformation that they've been on. So we have covered that in the past, and I think we can touch upon it again. But it would be great to hear your perspective on your meeting with him, and what you think these meetings are for. It's obviously this is the head of state of of Syria now. Why is he suddenly meeting with all of these analysts? And he's meeting with quite influential analysts and thinkers on Syria. You weren't the only one. I know many people he met with over the last few weeks. So there's clearly a push from Damascus for this. So maybe you could explain to me your thoughts on all of that, how it transpired, and what you think it's all aimed at.
I think part of it is that they want to just develop good relations outside of the country for people that are focused on it, and to provide some level of access to, people in power, so that they get their voices heard from their perspective. Um, Shara joked that sometimes he feels like journalists or researchers focus on details that are maybe less relevant than they actually are on the ground. Obviously, I have no way of knowing what he was specifically referencing or maybe who he was talking about. But I think part of it is they wanting to get their voices out there. I also think in the aftermath, of course, of what happened in Sweden, that they're kind of on their back foot a little bit, and that there's definitely some souring on the transition by some in Western countries in particular. Not everybody, of course. I mean, we've seen that the U.S. government has continued with its policy approach in the past 2 months, even in the face of what happened. Uh, but I think part of it is related to trying to help out with sort of that image. But I also think that, these guys are younger, so they have a different view on sort of governing and things along those lines than say some of the old school ways of doing things. And they understand that, talking to people that are not necessarily like influencers per se, but have been following these issues in a deep way for years, makes sense so that there's a good back and forth potentially. Of course, for me, just because I meet the guy doesn't mean I'm not going to still criticize what's going on if I disagree with it. So I think and I think that they understand it. I mean, Sharo is quite frank in some of his statements about him understanding the challenges as well as the criticism. They don't shy away from it or deny it like you hear from a lot of other world leaders, which I think is really fascinating, but also hopefully a good sign that they take on some of these criticisms, and eventually it'll get better over time. And it's also important to remember that it's only been 9 months since the fall of the regime. The country dealt with 14 years of civil war. 40% of the infrastructure is destroyed. There's 54 years of totalitarian rule. So these changes that people want to see like immediately, it's really difficult, even under the best of circumstances. In say really robust Western countries with really good economies. And so it's not easy. Of course, they've also made mistakes too. They're not necessarily always the best with messaging and expectations related to what they're doing, especially with their own public. When you talk to people, I think a lot of people on the ground also feel a little bit of a disconnect with the government at this point. But from my perspective, it's somebody that has studied Chara, as well as his group going all the way back to early 2012 when they first announced themselves as Jabhat al-Nusra. It was quite surreal. And then on top of it, not only just meeting him, because obviously there's people like Darin Khalifa and Jerome Drevon who met him back in Idlib, going back to 2019, 2020 time period when they were working with ICG or ICRC. But doing it in the presidential palace, which was the stage for Hafiz and Bashar, was just like, it's mind blowing. Honestly, it's still hard to believe that it was actually a week ago today that the meeting was. So it's just wild to think that anything along these lines could happen for somebody that was studying these guys for all these years.
I have to say, yeah, I agree with you, because I was in the presidential. I've never met with Al-Sharaa, but I was in the presidential palace the week of the fall. I think it was the Wednesday or the Thursday. I actually made it into the presidential palace. So that was a moment for me that I will never forget, because it was just so absolutely surreal. I guess it must be completely even more surreal now, because it's inhabited again, right? Whereas I'd seen this abandoned kind of, almost like a mausoleum, as it were, for the old regime. So I very much agree with how weird that might be. Look, we've had Jerome on it. I'd love to get Darine on as well, because she's obviously got a really great perspective to hear. But one of the things that we've talked quite a lot about this journey, about ideology and so on, we haven't talked much about Al-Sharaa as a man, and particularly not his age. It's important to note that he is the first millennial head of state in the Arab world, right? This is a huge thing in a part of the world where their leaders are normally above the age of 80. I mean, let's be clear, Bashar al-Assad was considered young, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that says something that is maybe not remarked upon. Obviously, there's Mohammed bin Salman, who is waiting in the wings, but he's still not the head of state. So it's unfair to. I know he's frequently talked about, but we haven't had that kind of, and I suppose clearly part of that press interest in bin Salman was artificially created. You know, he very much wanted to bring that idea of him as a young reformer. Al-Sharaa isn't doing that, but his age isn't really being remarked upon that much. So what do you think about the way he's going about things, and what do you think that his age has taught him about, you know, the Middle East and Syria's place in it, given that this is a place that you know is used to dynasties, basically?
Sure. I mean, he has an interesting history in of himself, and he's been a part of the history as well, going back to his family's history too. So I think he has a sense of things on some level. I mean, his grandparents and great uncles and things, they were a part of the insurgency that fought against, say, the French in the 1920s, and then his father was a critic of the Ba'ath regime, more of a Nasserist and leftist type figure, so a little bit different ideologically than what Shara came to himself. But I mean, he came of age during the Second Intifada, and back then, actually, he was at the same mosque that Khalid Mashal was at in the Mezze neighborhood in Damascus
You get the
in the early
impression
2000s.
you get the impression from his father that he's more disappointed that his son is a neoliberal than his son was a jihadist, right? I mean, that's sort of the funny thing.
Yes, 100%, 100%. He's like trolling him all the time. It's insane. So I wonder if there are questions about any daddy issues or not. But anyways, but yeah, I mean, he obviously was involved in the Iraq War, which was up until what happened in Syria, a defining moment in the region after 2000 in this millennium in many respects. Of course, most of the time he was spent imprisoned. But and then of course he took part in one of the worst wars we've seen since World War II in many respects, in terms of half the country either becoming refugees or IDPs. Um, the first really widespread use of chemical weapons in decades, as well as every other horrible thing that the regime did. And so I think he has some interesting experiences. And the fact that there was this transformation, I think, gives him some perspective as well, and what might work and what might not work too. Uh, and the thing to remember too is that just because he was, the leader of a insurgent group fighting the regime, because they also ruled, parts of northwest Syria for 8, 9 years before the fall of the regime. They also had some experience in governing as well. So while it's one thing to govern, a small enclave where nobody's really paying attention versus much of the country now where everybody is paying attention, they do have some lessons based off of some challenges they had to deal with over that 8, 9 year period as well. And so they kind of stack a lot of these experiences, whether personal experiences, whether related to ideology, whether related to governance, whether related to sort of the broader, historical sweep of what's been going on in the region last 20, 25 years. I think they bring a lot of that to the table. And then, of course, because Shar is young, many of the people around him are relatively young, most in their 30s, early 40s to mid 40s at most. There's a lot of dynamicism as well as excitement and energy to do things. I mean, these guys are sometimes working until 2 or 3 in the morning and then starting back up again at 7, 8 in the morning every single day. Like sometimes I worry that they're going to burn out. But I think that there's so much to be done because of how much of a hole the regime put them in, that everybody's just working like mad. I mean, I'll get messages from some people in the government sometimes, and it's like 8 or 9 p.m. in the US, and I'm like, I'm almost ready for bed, and they're still up working. So, but I'm a early riser myself. So,
Yeah, I mean, look, it's one thing that I have to say. I do share your criticisms. I've got very, very, very strong criticisms of the new authorities in Damascus. We've shared them on the show before, but I do want to point out again that there is a feeling, not just among us, amongst the majority of Syrians, that they really want this government to do well. They really want it to succeed and to reach this democratic transition that they have promised. So there is still this hope, and the government is still living on the sort of borrowed legitimacy of that hope. And obviously things might change down the line. They've had some very severe, significant issues so far that we've touched upon. But again, it is important to note that they are. It's a quite broad coalition of people that have formed this government and group of people working. Lots of people from the Syrian diaspora were picked. Lots of activists were picked for part of that. A question to you, I guess: do you think that in particular, that aspect of it, was HTS, now dissolved, calling them the Syrian transition government, their way of broadening and expanding the people that they are trying to govern with, because they are themselves acknowledging that they are no longer a paramilitary organization, as it were, and they have to have a much broader social fabric, social contract with the rest of the country?
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it. I think also many of the people in the diaspora have a lot of unique experiences, as well as are very highly educated and also connected in a variety of Western countries too. So that makes it also easier for this new government to connect to, potential, countries that they want to work with, more so than maybe if it was only just people that were just in Syria during the war the entire time. Um, uh, but what's interesting too is that as a consequence, actually, of the destruction of USAID by the United States, as well as a lot of the funding cuts through the State Department and other areas, many of the Syrians that were part of sort of local or regional NGOs in Syria or the Arab world have actually been recruited by the government too, because they had all these people that were no longer in jobs. So they also got a lot of these experienced people on these fronts as well. And so they've been able to really start to house a greater grouping of people that go beyond sort of what you traditionally think of HTS being, these like Salafist guys that are hardcore fighters, but actually these really well educated individuals that have connections to Western countries as well. And so within a lot of the bureaucracy, small compared to most governments, there's sort of this combination between more of these diaspora and worldly experiences, alongside maybe some of the other groups working as well. And so it's created this interesting fabric within the government at this point.
I do think the hiring of Raed al-Saleh was a perfect example of that. He, obviously, the founder of the White Helmets, now is the Minister for Emergency and Disaster Management in Syria. Now, I can think of no better person possibly in the world to be able to deal with a situation like that with the resources at his disposal. So, it's unfortunate that probably the best in class minister in the world that Syria can offer is someone who's experienced in emergency and disaster management, but it is also a very useful person to be bringing into government to deal with that. And again, the White Helmets, as much criticism as they've been under, false criticism for being part of HTS, or which they never were, this is a significant appointment. It is a new chapter, so it is one that should be acknowledged. I wanted to, again, I do want to jump into this sort of regional dynamic with Israel, but the big headline from this week really isn't even the UN General Assembly speech. That was kind of expected. Now we've been expecting that. What we weren't expecting is this interview with Petraeus, right? Which has blown the minds of a lot of people on the internet, and I'm not just talking random people. I'm talking, credentialed journalists who have sort of expressed outrage at this, and it expressed outrage at what they see as the kind of hypocrisy of US foreign policy over the past few decades. So they may have a point, but from my perspective, and I've argued this online if you've seen some of what I've been saying about it, that surely having a warlord turn away from transnational jihad and embrace, institutions and the international community is something that should be encouraged. And we can be cynical about it, and I would, encourage people to be skeptical and cynical about it. But to act as if doing that is an outrage and a hypocrisy sort of kind of defeats the purpose if your argument is that the US involves itself in quote unquote forever wars. If that's your point, surely we're looking at the closing of a chapter of a war that is clearly not a forever war if the war is over. So the kind of criticism sort of didn't ever ring true for me. So again, what was your take, your perspective on that Petraeus interview? How do you kind of contextualize it? No matter what your position on this, seeing Al-Sharaa crack jokes with Petraeus is about that time period is wild, right? It is a wild thing to see happen. But if you could, while you're explaining it, can you give us some context as to who Petraeus is and why it's so significant? Because our audience may not know that. They have a good idea of who Al-Sharaa is now, but they might not know what Petraeus's role was during those coalition years in Iraq and then later on afterwards.
Yeah, so David Patraeus was a key commander in the U.S. military during the Iraq War and was essentially the person that helped create the whole surge doctrine that led to sort of the pushback against Al-Qaeda in Iraq with the tribal Sunni forces, around the 2006, 2007 time period after the disasters of what happened from sort of 2003 to 2005 after the U.S. invaded and the growth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq through Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. But at the time that, Petraeus was involved in this fight, Sharaa himself had joined up with Al-Qaeda in Iraq to become a foreign fighter, and had been arrested by the U.S. and was housed in Camp Bucca, which was an infamous prison, for about 4 or 5 years. And so the fact that they were both kind of there at the same time, but on opposite sides of the battlefield, quote unquote, many people, obviously were quite surprised that this type of interview would happen, or maybe some people thought it was a troll, or something along those lines. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that Sharaa has changed in many respects. I mean, it's not as if Petraeus or the U.S. is going to roll out the red carpet for the current leader of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. I think a lot of it goes to show that if you change and you drop sort of global jihadism, you drop doing external attacks on countries, if you, sort of maybe not moderate, but, kind of transform a bit in terms of how you go about your business, then there will be opportunities that you could be brought back into the fold. I mean, for whatever reason, because it's jihadism, there's more exoticism related to this. But I think, we've seen cases where things like this have happened in the past, where former radicals or terrorists have then been brought in and seen as legitimate, whether it's, former IRA people in the context of the UK and Ireland, whether it's like Yasser Arafat in the context of Palestine. And there's, of course, a whole host of other cases too. People are acting as if, in many ways, Sharaa is, the same person that he was in 2014 or 2010 or what have you, when he's not. Time has changed. It's not frozen in amber or anything along those lines. We have a huge track record now also of this change since he broke from Al-Qaeda in July 2016. Need I remind you, that's 9+ years ago now, where they actually fought against Al-Qaeda after that. So people still saying, oh, he's an Al-Qaeda leader. It's kind of like, dude, you're not serious. Like, you're just sounding stupid. Or
Yeah.
people, in some ways, just like misgendering him by still calling him Jelani. It's like, get over it. Like, come on. Like, it's just different. It's so frustrating. Like, just earlier today when I was tweeting about his speech, somebody was like, "Oh, it's like Jelani, and like he's in New York. What if somebody gives him like plane lessons or something?" It's like, dude, come on, get over it. It's just, I don't know. It's just frustrating. Obviously,
I mean, look, I will say,
and the thing is that it's like, yeah, we understand the guy is not a liberal Democrat either. He's still conservative. He's still an Islamist. The government they're running isn't like a liberal democracy. It's still authoritarian on some level, but he's also not involved in transnational terrorism or like Al Qaeda or ISIS. It's just, we need to be very nuanced about this, and it's not a black and white issue, and it just can get frustrating at
I mean, look,
times.
the problem that I have with this is that even people that write about national security and defense in America, people whose work I respect, have basically zero to no knowledge of transnational jihad, Salafi jihadism, the ideology, the history. It's so much to learn. For example, I know a lot about that kind of stuff, and the inner workings of various groups in the Levant from, basically the foundation of Israel to now. That's what I've spent a lot of my time learning about. What I don't know much about is J dams and various different types of. Again, not one person can have all of that knowledge clued in. I rely on other people to inform me about various types of munitions and so on, and that's how we work. But the issue is, a lot of these people feel very confident in espousing whatever the article they've read that makes them think they understand everything. And I have to sympathize a little bit that having quite an intricate knowledge of what makes Al Qaeda and what makes ISIS and what's the difference between those two, which is it's like talking about the difference between the Revolutionary Communist Party and the Communist Party of Great Britain. It's such a ridiculous schism that you couldn't explain it to someone without looking ridiculous, and it's similar with this. But there is a sea change in the ideology of Al Qaeda and what Ahmed Al-Sharaa's group eventually became. In a way, they started modeling themselves much more on groups such as Ahrar al-Sham, even taking on that al-Sham label. It wasn't like this is something that's just happened overnight. They really have very much tried to rebrand in quite a fascinating way.
Thing people don't get is that it was like this really slow, gradual process. It didn't just happen on like December 8th. Like, they didn't just be like jumping out of a rabbit's hat and like be like, oh, we're changed, we're no longer global jihadis. Like, that process started when they broke from ISIS back in 2013, and then again in 2016 with the break from Al Qaeda, and then everything that happened since up until December 2024, and now of course the last 9 months or so. And it's also important to note that if you actually look at what jihadis are saying themselves from ISIS, from Al Qaeda, they are not happy with any of this.
No,
they hate these guys. They view them as apostate regimes in the Arab world. They're like, you guys have joined the ranks of like the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians and blah 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 blah. And so, just looking at from like one side, it's just like you're totally missing the picture of what actual jihadists are saying. It's just really simplistic in many ways.
I mean, another thing that we have heard that's wrong about this group is that this group is basically founded or was working in coordination with the MI6 and the CIA and so on and so forth over the course of the Civil War, which is complete bunkum. The other thing, and this pivots us nicely into the final topic, I guess, is that they are, by the Axis of Resistance people, pro-Assad people, they were frequently falsely accused of being a tool of Israel. And we saw really what Israel's view of this government was, and their view of, the Israeli government's view of their relationship with the Assad regime and their relationship with the new authorities, by the attacking of those military assets once they were no longer in the regime's hands, by the incursions into Syrian territory. The relationship between Damascus and the Israeli government right now is fraught. It is difficult, but the authorities are this is not just my opinion. This is the opinion of basically many learned Israeli researchers on Syria, because over the course of the civil war, many Israelis got involved in covering this, and I've noticed a huge difference in the way those Israeli, many pro-Israel people, but the way they talk about what the government policy is in Syria with the way the Israeli government is talking. It sounds like the Israeli experts on this are going, "What are you doing? This is crazy," and the government is kind of not listening to those people at all, despite this being the field of expertise that they've invested 14 years in. So could you break down what the kind of ins and outs of what's been going on between Damascus and Israel over the past 10 months, 11 months, whatever it's been? And one of the things that was interesting is the way Al-Sharaa was talking about the Abraham Accords and saying how they don't have the will of the Arab street. They may have Arab governments, but the Arab street still hasn't. And that for Syria to have this kind of agreement with Israel, there needs to be some kind of buy-in from the people. It's an interesting thing to say, whether you kind of buy fully that he means it or not. But what do you take those comments to mean with regards to where these negotiations with Israel are going? And do you think there is going to be some kind of agreement made with the government? Because it would seem to fly in the face of the military strategy that the Israeli government has been pursuing recently.
Yeah, I mean, I've said to many people that I'll believe it when I see it. But even if there is some kind of agreement, I don't think anybody's under any illusions that the Israelis will necessarily also follow the agreement. We've obviously seen them break the ceasefire with Hezbollah, maybe a little bit more legitimate, just because Hezbollah sucks. But when I spoke to Shara, he also mentioned that even if there is an agreement, that they are fully aware that it might not still lead to 100% peace on the border inside Syria as well. So they understand the reality and the limitations they have. I mean, they of course have no control over their airspace themselves. Israel is, much stronger country. It also has the backing of the U.S., even if the U.S. in many ways disagrees with Israel's policies in Syria. But there's sort of this weird dynamic where, because generally the U.S. and Israel are usually in line, it's hard for them to have agreements and know how to deal with that in a normal manner, as well as the fact that Israel's in the region, so the U.S. isn't going to do too much about it. But essentially, after the fall of the Assad regime, airstrikes against much of the Assad regime's military assets, so that it wouldn't get in the hands of the new government, because they feared that they would then use it against Israel. And since that point, over the last 9+ months or so, we've seen that Israel has conducted more than 1,000 airstrikes in Syria, as well as probably up to around 500 incursions at this point. They've taken over the other side of the Hermon Mountain, as well as taken over much, if not all, of the buffer zone that was created in the aftermath of the 1973 war, which was constructed in the 1974 border agreement, which is what the Syrian government continues to talk about since December 8th, related to the fact that they want to go back to that agreement and focus on it, and that they agreed to it. Their whole point has been, look, we just went through 14 years of war. We're a tired country. We don't want to fight more. We just want to rebuild the country and redevelop economically and integrate ourselves back in the good graces of the regional international community after the way Assad acted the last 15 years or so. But they also understand that there's little that they can do, because if they fought back, we've seen what Israel has done over the last now almost 2 years since the 10/7 attack, whether it's related to Hamas or just Gaza more broadly. We've seen it in southern Lebanon with Hezbollah. We've also seen it with the attacks that they've done in Iran, as well as against the Houthis in Yemen. And so they're not naive that Israel would not just destroy everything in Syria too, potentially, especially considering the fact that 40% of the infrastructure in the country is already destroyed as a consequence of Assad. And it wouldn't take much to undo this government, because it is still pretty weak, considering it doesn't fully control the whole country still. Israel has more or less stopped it from controlling the south in Quneitra, Dara, and Sueda, where the Druze are. And then, of course, they don't control the northeast, which is almost a third of the country, which is still controlled by the uh, Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. And so, even though we talk about Syria, it's still not whole again as it was prior to 2011. And so Syria's in this hard position where they're they want to accept something because they just want to be left alone, but they also understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that Israel is just going to stop, even if they do. And as we've seen more recently with the airstrike against Hamas in Qatar, even potential U.S. guarantees related to an agreement between Israel and Syria might not be trusted either, since obviously there's been a big backlash in the Gulf states related to that too. And the thing to remember also is that there's sort of this consensus in many ways in Syria, between Turkey, between the Gulf states, between Europe, between the United States. Everybody wants to see it succeed. The only countries that really don't are Israel on some level, and then of course Iran, because they obviously were on the opposite side of the war against the revolution. And so it's this weird situation where Israel and Iran, two countries that ostensibly dislike each other, are on the same side or agree with one another related to the fact that they don't want things to succeed in Syria too. And so it's a weird situation, especially when you think about Israel backing some of these Druze militia, which have a number of former Assad regime officials in it as well, which had previously been working with the Iranians too. And so there's just like a weird scenario related to that, even though obviously, people start getting into conspiracy theories about a million things left and right, but I don't think there's any conspiracy between Israel and Iran on this front. It's just more just the craziness of how the change dynamic has led to these different relationships now on the ground that had once been more related to Iran, and now Israel's kind of picking it up instead.
Well, look, after many years of being falsely accused of supporting Israel's ambitions in the Middle East due to my opposition to the Assad regime, I do think it's quite funny that Israel and Iran may be on the same side of one argument. So I'm perfectly fine with people running with that narrative and using it against those people, because that's funny to me. That's irony. So look, we're in the final part of the show where we ask the audience if they want to throw any questions towards Aaron. So if you've been watching along on Twitter, we've had 1,500 people on tonight. So a lot of people clearly interested in learning more about what's been going on with the Syrian transition government visiting the United States. So welcome along. If you want to ask a question, the only way to do that is to come along onto Twitch. Create an account and fire away in the chat box, and we will ask it as always. And if you do, please do like and follow along the page. And if you're following along on YouTube, obviously you can't contribute to us live, but please do put some comments down below. I do read all of the comments down on YouTube, and please do like and subscribe. I did have one question that I kind of skipped over for you, and that was about Petraeus. And again, more about the reaction to that interview, the cynical reaction to that interview, and a little bit of cynicism. Cynicism is to be expected and healthy, but the kind of thing that I take sort of issue with is the idea that this is sort of the sort of something that flies in the face of the war on terror, as if the war on terror lost because of this X, Y, and Z. And I do think the war on terror had many, many issues that I would love to get into on another hour-long show. But on this specific point, having Petraeus, the man who coordinated the surge, sitting down with a Sunni warlord who is now cooperating with the US authorities, seems about as big a win for the Petraeus school of thought when it comes to insurgency in the Middle East than he could ever possibly have imagined, right? So that's my interpretation of it. I wondered if you had thoughts along similar lines.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as if the U.S. is accepting or Petraeus is accepting some ISIS caliphate and he's interviewing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi the week after he announces the caliphate in Mosul or something. In many ways, Sharaa came closer to sort of the normal norms of the international system than the U.S. going towards that alternative version of an Islamic State, or however you want to describe what ISIS did over the years. Um, and it's not surprising then that opponents of Sharaa, especially ISIS guys, call him Sahawat, or essentially saying that he's just like the Sahwa people during the surge in the tribes in Iraq, and those guys have since been integrated back into normal political life too. And so yeah, it's a weird argument. I think in some ways a lot of it is an American argument where
It's
people are
of course
still
an American
annoyed
argument.
about the US, and yeah, about the US invasion of Iraq, and people are still like arguing about political arguments that happened 20 years ago now, and it's like the whole context in the region is completely shuffled and changed. Like, get over it. Yeah, it was stupid to invade Iraq. I don't think anybody disagrees with that at this point. And if you don't, then that's kind of weird. But either way, like the story has moved on, though. Like it's just a totally different scenario. It's just bizarre.
So, look, we do have one final question for you. That's coming from Dilly Daedalus, saying, any thoughts on the recent strategy plan for resolving the situation in Sweden, or predictions for how the issues with the Northeast are going to play out? I know predictions is not something that we try and encourage in this, but you are someone who has been in conversation with the authorities in Syria. So you might be able to tell us about how they're thinking they could try and resolve it.
Yeah, and at least not this trip, but when I was there in April, I also had a chance to go down to Sweden too. Of course, it was before what happened in July, so the context is slightly different from what I saw. But I mean, it's definitely a difficult position, especially since the main actor that has gained the most from the violence in Sweden was Hikmat al-Hijri, who's sort of this extremist Druze cleric in many ways.
Drug dealer.
Uh, yeah, his son is involved in the Captagon trade. This new formation, the National Guard force that he helped create. There's a number of former Assad regime officials. The official spokesperson for this new group was an Assad regime guy in the Republican Guard who liaised with the Iranians. And so, but the problem is that the local population, because they feel burned by what happened, will be less conciliatory. And so, even though there have been these different arrangements that the U.S., Jordan, the Syrian government have tried to come up with to open up the roads, provide more aid, reestablish commercial activity, every time this happens, Hijri puts out statements like this. And it doesn't help that the Israelis embolden this activity as well. And so, until that changes, where the Israelis back off a little bit, there's more moderation by Hijri. Um, uh, I think that all of these types of scenarios that they're trying to accomplish are going to be very difficult to do, because the local population is just not into it at this point. Because rightfully they're fearful, because I think at least 1,500 people were killed for no apparent reason, besides their identity, of course. In terms of the Northeast, I mean, unfortunately, we've seen negative trends related to that as well, especially since what happened in Sweden, where the SDF, Kurds in many ways, they've been dragging their feet on the integration process, because they feel like they can, play a waiting game. Maybe for whatever reason, they think that maybe the government's going to fall for whatever reason, or maybe the Israelis will take them out, and then they'll just be able to continue on with their experiment in the Northeast. But my worry is that because there was the agreement between Sharaa and Mazlum Abdi, the leader of the SDF, and that they're supposed to integrate by the end of the year, that could lead to a scenario, but that by the closer we get to the end of the year, there could be more if it doesn't happen. And there's also then the worry that if it doesn't happen, that in the new year, the Turks and the government might go in and try and do another operation because they're dissatisfied with it. Because obviously they want to resolve that issue alongside sort of the broader PKK peace initiative that they've been doing this year, which of course could then draw on the Israelis more and have sort of this proxy war between Turkey and Israel in northeast Syria. So there's a lot of risks. I mean, obviously it's hard to predict, but these are obvious, of course, potential scenarios that could happen. I'm hoping that this all works out more on a diplomatic, because it's better for everybody on the ground. Nobody wants to see any more violence on any side, I don't think. As well as it being better for the stability of the country in general, as well as the transition, and hopefully everybody can work together for a better path. But unfortunately, as a consequence of actions that have occurred, that's then also changed the reality on the ground and sort of the way the perceptions are too. And so the Syrian government also has to deal with the mistakes that they made as well, and try and learn from that too. And unfortunately, some thought that maybe they would have from what happened on the coast, but clearly it had happened again in Sweden too, unfortunately. And so hopefully, it doesn't happen again, because then the transition will really fall off the rails also. Not necessarily in terms of some outside countries like in the Gulf, because they might care less about things along those lines, but definitely support from Western countries, I think, would be a bit more difficult. It already took a bit of a dent with what happened in Sweden. But if another thing happened, especially if it related to the SDF, which of course the US and the West worked with a lot in the fight against ISIS, that would hurt a lot, I would think. But obviously anything can happen, and like you said, it's hard to predict anything 100%. But it's always good to think about different scenarios and pathways. And of course, I think for both of us, we just want the best for Syria. So
yeah, I mean, look, I totally share your sentiments there about the Northeast, and I really hope that this can be brought to a peaceful resolution as quickly as possible. The other thing I will say, and we brought it up on the show before, that I really believe that the pathway to this government being legitimized and being seen as legitimate is there has to be accountability for crimes, and if there are still people walking around who committed human rights violations, atrocities against Druze, Alawite civilians, or even you can't commit atrocities against armed people either under the Geneva Conventions. So the point being that without this accountability, there can't be a wider buy-in to this government, and this government has not yet been able to achieve the accountability that I know Syrian people demand from their authorities. That was, part of why they revolted in the first place. Anyway, look, it was wonderful to have you on, Aaron. Where can people find your work? I will obviously put a link to your X account, and I will put a link to the book that you wrote on Hayat al-Sham in the show notes. But where else can people find you if they want to see your day-to-day sort of reports?
Yeah, I mean, mainly just on X, posting every day about what's going on in Syria, and then of course my main articles are just on the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's website. Too scared of TikTok as a as somebody that doesn't want to give into any of the Chinese technologies. So X is the main place to go for me, at least.
For now. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much, Aaron. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. You helped out last minute, so I really do want to thank you again for coming on the show. And maybe have you got on again in the future to tell us more about what's been going on in Syria and beyond. So, Aaron Zelin, thank you so much. Take care. All the best.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
That was Aaron Zelin. Thank you, all of you, for tuning in for another show. I hope you found it enjoyable. I hope I managed to formulate some ideas and respond to some of the sort of people I've been disagreeing with on the internet over the last 48 hours. I doubt any of them watched this, but I don't like to leave debates not had. I'd prefer to just sort of discuss them. Anyway, we've done that tonight. We've got another show for you tomorrow. Hopefully talking about the DHL parcel bombings or attempted bombings by the Russian state that they believe were responsible for this campaign. So look, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But again, thank you all of you for tuning in to another show. Please do consider liking, following, and subscribing if you don't already. And do leave us comments down in the YouTube comment section if you are watching along. It'd be great to hear from you. I do read all of those comments. So again, thank you everyone. Thank you Smirkin for your first time chat. Thank you Crouching Tigger, Ringos, Spazalot, Liquid Amber, Dilly Daedalus, RGB, RVB, and Zen. All of you guys in the chat tonight, really appreciate you all. And yeah, do keep coming back for more, and I will see you on the next one.